All right, we're going to be into the book of Ecclesiastes today. One of the things that I want to ask is how many of you have ever really read the book of Ecclesiastes? That's what I figured. I mean, most people weren't real familiar with this little book. For the most part, people shy away from it because it's a hard book to understand. It was a hard book to interpret or translate from a scholarly point of view. Also, let me ask you, how many of you have ever heard a sermon from the book of Ecclesiastes? You've probably never heard one from the book of Ecclesiastes. Probably the only time that you've ever heard anything in the form of the book of Ecclesiastes in sermon form was at a funeral where they use one of the verses from chapter 3 where it talks about there's a time to live or a time to be born and a time to die. So that's probably your only exposure in a sermon to the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, a lot of people don't like the book of Ecclesiastes just simply because it's a hard book to understand. I myself, I like it because I think it's a book about being realistic. It's a book about life experience. It's a book that talks a lot about the different things that a person will go through in life, a bunch of different realities that people will find in life. Now, one of the things I think that people have trouble with or just kind of struggle with the book is that there's really no cohesive type of structure with it. Just to give you an example, like there's you have a very short introduction, and you have a very short conclusion, and in the center of it you have the body of the letter or the book, and there's no real structure to it. It's really it goes all over the place. There's really not one theme that it particularly covers in one part, and then here, and then here, and then here. And so it's really a different type of structured book as to where if we compare it to, let's go back to Genesis. In Genesis, as well as a lot of the other books that we've already went through, there is a structure that you can go to, and you can kind of read it that way, and that's what makes it difficult with Ecclesiastes, because it's not really that way. So just to give you an example, let's go back to Genesis. And when we look at Genesis, if I wanted to talk about the origins, if I wanted to talk about creation, Noah's Ark, I wanted to talk about those things like that, we can immediately say, okay, I can go to Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 11, and I know that this is talking about the origins of creation and the human species. And so that's very structured. I know that's where I'll find it. So likewise in Genesis, if I say, all right, I want to talk about the patriarchs. And so I can very easily say, all right, if I want to talk about patriarchs, I want to learn about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I know that I can turn to Genesis chapter 12, actually the very end of chapter 11, but chapter 12 all the way through chapter 36, I know that I'm going to learn about the life and times of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the patriarchs. Now, I want to learn about Joseph. So I know, there again, in Genesis, I can go and learn about Joseph and being reunited with his family, his rise through the ranks and his troubles with the different things there, but how he came to be second in power of Pharaoh and his life. I know that I can turn to chapter 37 all the way through chapter 50 of Genesis. So that's how it's structured. So that's how we can read it. And most of the other books, like I've already said, most of the other books, we can read or find some sort of structure that way, where Ecclesiastes is different because there is no real structure to it other than an introduction and a conclusion at the very beginning and at the very end. And it really just kind of goes all over the place in the middle. Now, I think one thing that we need to just kind of go over here, in talking about the book itself, the book of Ecclesiastes, we talk about the authorship. Now, The authorship, this is where people, they have a lot of different interpretations of this book. And the reason being is because there's no real consensus on who wrote it. For a long time in church history, it was considered that Solomon had wrote the Book of Ecclesiastes. Now, the reason that there was consensus here, if we turn to Ecclesiastes 1:1, it tells us or gives us an idea of that this might be Solomon. So it says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So, it kind of fits Solomon because he was the son of David and he was king in Jerusalem. Or king, it was king in Jerusalem. So, those are pretty good credentials to say that this was in fact a book about him or was written by him. The other part of that is that people have trouble with, if this was Solomon, they have some issue with, in the beginning part of this and at the very end, if Solomon wrote this, then he was talking in the third person through those parts, and talking in the first person in others. So they believed that there was someone else may have compiled or wrote this, and so there's not a lot of scholarly consensus on that. It's a difficult book to understand, and it comes from having a lack of understanding of who wrote it and the perspective. Now, here's what I want you to understand about what I'm about to say, and I'm in the minority of thinking on this. There's really not a lot or any scholarly consensus on the explanation I'm about to give you on my own personal thoughts about the authorship of the Book of Ecclesiastes. Now, this is my opinion about what I'm reading and how I interpret what I've read and what I know about Solomon. Now, my perspective of how I read the Book of Ecclesiastes is taken from a person who was at the end of their life, had realized that they had wasted their life, and at the very end of their life regretted how they lived and wanted to leave a record of it to teach others that living your life this way was meaningless or is meaningless. And we'll get into that a little bit later. We'll talk about some of the themes of this book, and certainly vanity or meaningless, how it's translated in some versions. Certainly that is a theme of the book, but we'll get there later. But in my perspective, in what I read of Ecclesiastes and what my understanding of King Solomon. Now, King Solomon, we know, if he did write this, I think we could deal very easily with the beginning and end of this, and the talking in the third person instead of talking in the first person. Now, it was not uncommon. Now, we see this in the New Testament. In the New Testament, there were people who would get people to write things for them, kind of like a secretary. It's called an amanuensis, and we know that Paul, he had an amanuensis at times where he didn't actually pen the words himself, but actually he spoke the words and someone wrote them down for him. And so I don't think it's any stretch of the imagination that this is something that possibly could have been achieved here. I believe it is entirely possible that if this was an old Solomon, now remember, this is just my opinion. This is Kevin Rollins' personal opinion on this matter. There's not, if any scholarly consensus on what I'm saying. This is just how I read it, how I interpret it. That, for me, it's not a stretch that Solomon, at the end of his life, wanted to leave a record, and he had someone write it down. And so I think that would actually take care of the beginning and end, where it's recorded in the third person, where it's not actually Solomon writing it, but it could be his amanuensis. They were writing to give us an idea of who it was that they were writing about and why, and then they recorded what Solomon had to say. And then at the very end, they wrote a conclusion about what Solomon had to say. And so I don't think that's any stretch of the imagination, considering that we know that people did that. And we know that people did that even in our own Bible. So that's where I come from. I think this is, my interpretation, I think this is where we have King Solomon, if he wrote this, he's in his old age, he's lived a life, he's realized that throughout his life that he lived in such a way that he did it without God, and he realized that in doing so, that he had everything, he lacked for nothing, he had power, he had wisdom, he had money, he had everything that he desired. But yet it was all meaningless because he lived a life without God. And so, again, that's just my interpretation of how I view this and who could have written it. Scholars, they have a bunch of different interpretations of who they think could have written this, when it could have been written, a lot of different things. Now, this is just my interpretation, and I could be entirely wrong. But just knowing as you read through this, and because this is such a hard book to understand, for me at least, again, my opinion, my interpretation, but when I think that Solomon wrote this, or at least he was the one speaking the words and having someone record them, it fits his life perfectly. Now, we don't have a record of Solomon ever repenting or ever being feeling like he regretted his life, but certainly we have enough record of him doing things that he shouldn't have done. So all the things that are mentioned here that the author records, that the person that's recording this, is that they regretted so many things in their life, and they're all things that Solomon had. And so that's why, in my belief, is that this is, maybe if Solomon didn't write it, he was at least the one speaking, and he had an amanuensis writing it down. Now, I mean, I've known people who have lived like this, who, had a lot, and, at the end of their life, they had a lot of regret. And I'm sure maybe some of you probably knew some of those people too.
It's got will and pain. It can't handle it,
Yeah.
Just like Elvis, They just he wrestled with that probably all his life,
And we see a lot of people that way. I mean, I've seen people who have, lived a life of luxury and live a life of
still not satisfied,
having a lot of stuff, and they're not satisfied. And you see, it gets to a point in their life where, they live with a life of regret. And by that point, there's not a lot of life left. And so, I see that, I read that in this book. And again, whether I'm right or wrong, my speculation is that this is an old Solomon writing this at the end of his life. And I think as you look at the beginning and the end, you have the person writing from their perspective. They're saying, okay, here's the king, and this is who he is. And then in the middle part of the book, he's writing down what Solomon is conveying to him. So that's just my opinion. Again, minority, if any scholarly consensus at all about what I said, but that's just me. This is what I get out of it. So when I read this, this is my perspective, how I interpret it, and how I see things. So, but in the very first verse, we have a little bit of what it says about Solomon. Now, like I said, basically the structure of the book, there really is not much structure of the book as far as how we take structure in all the other books of the Bible. This one's a little different. About the only structure you get is the very, 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 very beginning and the very, very, very end. It's just a few verses at the beginning and the end, and the rest of it, there's really no rhyme or reason throughout the rest of it. It's just kind of a lot of different topics going back and forth. And so we look here. So basically, you have an introduction basically of the talking about who it is that he's talking about, whether it's Solomon or not, but we know that it's a king, at least, a king in Jerusalem. And it kind of gives us a, like I said, it just kind of gives us an introduction about kind of what the book is going to be about. So it says, Vanity of Vanity, says the preacher. And, you know, talking about that, there are several themes throughout the book. There may not be a structure, but there are certainly themes that you can pick out throughout the book. Now, obviously, the second verse here says, Vanity of Vanities, says the preacher, Vanity of Vanities, all is vanity. So that's a lot of vanity in the in that second verse. Half of the uses of this word in the Old Testament are found in Ecclesiastes. So that's one of the themes that you will see in this book is vanity of life. Now, vanity here, the way that we read it, it's an interesting word to try and interpret because it's one of those words in Hebrew that in order to translate it or interpret it, you've got to understand the context. So it can be the exact same word, but depending on what the context of the sentence is, determines which word you use. So if you think that interpreting Hebrew or translating Hebrew is easy, it is not. So that's one of the challenges that you find in, like, if you read different versions of this book, you will see different words used for vanity. You'll see vanity, you'll see meaningless. Does anybody have any other words in your Bible? I know vanity and meaningless, I know those are the two that come to mind. But it's used over 30 times. This word vanity or vanities is used over 30 times just in the book of Ecclesiastes. And that's half as many times as it's used in the entire Old Testament. So the author likes this word.
You know, most is meaningless.
Yeah. Now, in order trying to understand what it means, and like I said, you have to take it within context. So kind of a more literal translation of it would be, based on the context, would be an emptiness or a vanity. Another way of translating it would be a vapor or breath. Like something that's not lasting, something that's, you know, just... So, you know, trying to put that into words is hard. But also trying to define that is hard. But if you use it figuratively, it can mean something transitory or unsatisfactory. Now, that one is a little easier to define because that's where we get meaningless. Something that's unsatisfactory, if you look at somebody who's not satisfied with the life that they have lived and has realized that it's meaningless. Everything that they did in their life was meaningless because there was something that they didn't inject into it, which was God. If you live a life, you can have it all, but if you don't have God, you don't have anything. It's just meaningless. And it's only until you find God, it's only until you have God in your life that your life has that meaning.
Peace.
And so that's what the author is trying to convey here. So that is one of the themes of this book, is vanity of life. Another theme throughout this book is sin and death. So throughout the book, the author is keenly aware of the reason of death. They seem keenly aware that sin and the deeds of this life are the culprit for death. Sin is ultimately the reason for death. So if we go back to creation, death didn't exist before sin entered into the equation. Once sin entered in the equation, then that's when death became a reality for God's creation. So the author is keenly aware of it, the author understands it, and he writes it down beautifully in a lot of ways. Another thing that you'll find throughout this book is the joy and frustration of work. Trying to find joy in work, but also being very frustrated at work. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever liked what you did, but sometimes, man, it can just get very frustrating. And that's one of the things, again, if you go back to creation, it tells us there in Genesis 3, one of the curses that God placed on man was that originally, when he found joy in his work, it really wasn't tiresome. It didn't toll on him. He appreciated it. He had joy in it. He was happy about it. But one of the curses was that he was no longer going to have that. He was not just going to have the joy of it. He was also going to have toil. It was going to be harder to get. It was going to be harder on him. He was going to now have sweat of the brow trying to work the ground. So anybody that's ever tried to plant a garden knows that sometimes it can be really aggravating if you have hard ground to work with. Or have ground that doesn't really work too good. A lot of times people will bring in topsoil, they'll bring in all types of stuff and put in the ground in hopes that the garden that they're going to plant will produce better. All of that also is a result of sin. So we know that we can find joy in it, but also we find that frustration. So the author is quite aware about that. Another thing that he talks about within that framework is that when we talk about how much we work, how much we build on our life, and the things that we collect and accumulate, one of the things that he talks about is that in the end, it really doesn't matter because all of the things that you have built up in your life are going to be left behind.
Amen.
So he's talking about all the work, all the effort that you have put into all these things. And this is one of those things, you can take what I just said and you can take another verse out of Ecclesiastes where it seems like he's contradicting himself. Well, if you just take certain thoughts and you take where you're just speaking out, and not necessarily questioning God, but just talking about life in general, it's a reality that we do accumulate things, we do work hard for things, but it's also a reality that in the end, we're not going to take it with us. That's just a reality. That's not really a contradiction. It's just a reality. And I think that's where a lot of people have problems when they're reading this and think, well, that sounds like a contradiction, but it's really not a contradiction. It's just a reality of life. Now, but he also touches on And this goes to the next theme that we'll find in this book, is the grateful enjoyment of God's good gifts. Notice I said the grateful enjoyment of God's good gifts. Now, the author does spend a lot of time talking about the realities of the fallen world. Now, we realize that we live in a fallen world, right? That's a reality. That's one that we have to live with, in which we know that life is not perfect. We know that not everything's always going to go our way. And that's one of the things that I myself and some other people have with these prosperity preachers, is that they don't ever talk about that. It's like, they're trying to trick people into thinking that, well, if you have a bad day, then it's your fault, and it's because you didn't give enough money, and so God's not blessing you because you didn't give enough. Well, that's just not true. There's a reality in life that it rains on the good and the bad, and the author is aware of that, and he talks about that within this book. So he's grateful of God's good gifts, but he's not blind to the fact that there are things that happen in this fallen world because, again, talking about sin. Sin brings that upon mankind. There are things in this world that we have no control over. He's aware of it, but he's also not blind to the beauty of God's creation. Again, that might seem like a contradiction when he's talking about the two in two different places. But again, it's not a contradiction, it's just a reality. We realize that we live in a fallen world, but we can also be very grateful and realize that we live in a beautiful place. Planet Earth is amazing. In a lot of ways, in most ways, it's man who's messed it up.
Amen.
When you go to places that are like slums, that's because of humans. Humans have done that. But if you go someplace where it's just pristine, it hasn't been touched by man, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. Even if you go out to some of these deserts, you can see God's amazing work on how things work there. You go into a desert that's, over 130 degrees at some points, and then somehow or another you find life there. How could life survive there? And then you go to other places where it's so cold, it's like, how does life exist there? But it does. And so the author here, again, realizes we live in a fallen world that's not perfect, but being grateful of God's good gift to man, of His creation, for us to enjoy. And then another theme is the fear of God. That's something that you find in this book. Having a recognition, that awe and reverence, the fear of God that we should have when we think about Him, when we approach Him. I think that might be an important theme, probably the most important thing throughout the book if we really wanted to do one. The author talks about here, he talks about there's a lot of good in this world, and he recognizes that, but he also wants to talk about with any good or blessing or anything that might come our way, he conveys it in a way that's talking about it's only meaningful if God is in it. Having that fear of God and recognizing that, if you're blessed with something, that ultimately that came from God. And so that's something that the author here illustrates. And if you take a man who lived his life not thinking about that, and then at the end of his life recognizing that he had everything and he threw it away, and that it was all meaningless because God was not involved with it, I think you have Ecclesiastes. For me, it's not too big of a stretch. It's not too big of a stretch to imagine that that's what happened here. But at any rate, that's just my thoughts on it. So let's just read part of chapter 1 here, just to get an essence of what he's talking about, what the author's talking about, what we have in store. And we're not going to go through every verse of everything. We just don't have the time, so we're going to hit the high spots like we have with other books. And if there's something that you read that hits you, you want to discuss it, just say something and we'll spend some time on it. Because something that might mean something to you may not mean as much, or you might find something that I didn't even see and didn't think about. So if you find something, just let me know. See, let's begin at verse 2. Vanity of Vanity, says the preacher. Vanity of Vanities, all is vanity. Or you can put meaningless there. I think that fits the context of that. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness, and man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after me. So I think one of the things there, a couple things, is he's talking about, if you look at verse 9 and verse 10, I think that's a good place to really focus on. He said, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. And so I don't think he's talking about here about technology or anything like that, because somebody might be able to use that argument. Well, they didn't have cell phones back then. Well, that might be the case, but I just don't believe that's what he's talking about. What I think he's talking about, because if you read the book, he's talking about human interactions. He's talking about human relationships. He's talking about the things between man and God and man to man. And so when you understand it like that, he says, what has been is what will be. So we understand that there's fallenness in the world. That has been, and it will continue to be. There's a time when God's going to erase that, but for the time being, as we live in this life, we know that that is a reality. It seems dim, it seems gloomy, or another word, dark, that you might want to use, but it's reality. We live in a fallen society, don't we? So we understand, go all the way back to the beginning with Cain and Abel. Man is still killing man, and a lot of times for no reason. So what has been will continue to be. We see that. But also, if you think about it, about the good. There is good that has always been, and there's good that will always will be. God is eternal. So, as long as God is still here, there's always going to be good. So we know that He's always going to be here. So that tells us there's always going to be good. There's always going to be light. So you can take the two references, that there's always been bad, there always will be bad, and there's always been good, and there always will be good. So you can take that and look, this is human experience. It's just reality. I think sometimes people put too much into it. Just like with Revelation sometimes, or prophecy. I think they try and put too much into it instead of sometimes just taking it for as it is. Another thing here, it says, is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new. It has been already in the ages before us. So, people just being people. I think I mentioned this one time before, but some of the earliest evidence we have of civilization in the Middle East, there was some very prosperous dynasties who had some very ornate knives that were found, daggers, statues and things like that, and there was tablets where there was this I can't remember if it was Akkadian or something. This was prior to the Jewish habitation of Israel. And they found these tablets, and this was, I want to estimate that what I consider as a young earth, not as millions of years, because somebody else might date this event much, much later or earlier. But I go with a creationist point of view that we live in a young earth. God created everything in 6 days, and He rested on the seventh, a literal 6 days. So I don't think that we're that old. And looking at it that way, this king would have been not long after the Tower of Babel. It would have been sometime in that time frame, maybe around the time that the pyramids were being built. Because the pyramids were built before the Jews ever got to Egypt. A lot of people don't realize that, but those were built a long time before the Jews ever got there. So maybe this was during that time frame, like 3500 BC. So for me, I think it had to have been right after the flood, right after the flood, and then the Tower of Babel. So you had a few generations, and then you had this society. But what I'm getting at is, here's a king, and it just made me laugh when I read it, because when they translated it, he was talking about how there was corruption and how things were different, and he says, I just wish we could go back to the good old days. Now, that was in approximately 3500 BC. Here it is 2021 AD, so we're looking at what, 5,700 years, and we're still saying the same thing? Is there anything new under the sun? No. So that's something, that I think that here that shows wisdom, that people are always going to be people. There's really nothing new as far as interactions of people. So I think this is writing from experience and reality, and from a place of wisdom. Now, if we continue to look along, in chapter 2, he talks a little bit about the vanity of self-indulgence. I think we know something about that. And like I said, I'm not going to read everything here. I think one of the things here that I wanted to read, and where it was maybe talking about, maybe this was Solomon, maybe some evidence here, starting with verse 4, chapter 2. It says, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks, and planted them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. Now, a lot of people will take that as saying, okay, well, if you look at how many kings there were before Solomon, there was only 2 kings, and there was only one other king in Jerusalem before Solomon. Because remember, even though Saul was king of Israel, he wasn't necessarily king of a united Israel, and his capital was not in Jerusalem. It wasn't until David became king that the capital was moved to Jerusalem. So a lot of people say, well, this is definitive evidence that this was not written by Solomon, because there was only one other king before him. Now, the thing that I see here is he said that I gathered from my, more than any other who had been before me in Jerusalem. Now, he doesn't necessarily talk about the other kings before him there, does he? He just says others. Do you think don't you think there were other wealthy people in Jerusalem or in Israel before he came along? Sure. I mean, there was a lot of wealthy people who came along. I mean, there were other kings who lived in the area. You know, there were other, you know, because I mean, they were always fighting with somebody. There was always wealthy people. And so the king was not the only wealthy person. And so he's saying here that he had accumulated more than anybody else before him. That, to me, it doesn't say king, so I think that leaves that open to interpretation that maybe he was talking about in general. Again, I just think that's where people are looking too far, you know, looking too much into something. Now, here's another thing that I thought, well, maybe this gives some credence to him being who this is talking about. Verse 8 says, I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. Now we know that Solomon is famous for having 700 wives and 300 concubines. So we know that he was not a happy man. It's all right, you can grin. Phil, you can smile. It's all right.
Looked like he wore himself out.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
He was busy, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. Yes, he was. Don't seem like there was much time to do anything else, was it? And we know that as we read about him, we know that that was the cause of a lot of his downfall, because they were the ones who led him into idolatry. So verse 9 says, so I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and all this was my reward for all my toil. Verse 11 says, then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So he talks about all the greatness that he was, all the things that he accumulated, all the riches, all the possessions of inanimate things and animate things, such as servants and flocks. You know, it talks about how many horses and how many chariots and how much silver and how much gold, all the things that he accumulated. And he also talks about it not just from himself, but from other kings. Talks about all these treasures. But he says, but hey, in the end, it was all meaningless.
Well, you know, we talked about this thing before about, you know, Solomon had all these wives and everything, and I'm sure a lot of wives were foreign wives, and they had different religions.
Yes, they did.
And they influenced him.
Exactly.
And probably confused him.
Yeah. You know, and you know, he says that he retained his wisdom. He never lost his wisdom.
Yeah.
So just because you're wise doesn't mean you can't make a bad decision. I think that's important to remember. I know a lot of wise people, but sometimes they still make pretty poor choices. So basically, this is the body of the letter here, from chapter 1, verse 12, all the way to 12:8. There's really no kind of scientific structure or anything that you can put here. It's just a bunch of different topics that he touches on. A lot of it has to do. Now, if you want to trace those themes, I think you can maybe take some thematic elements, but even then, they're kind of scattered throughout the book, and he touches back on a lot of them in different places. So it's really hard just to pick a structure. But here he was talking about the vanity of self-indulgence. it says that he allowed his eyes, he said if his eyes saw it, he had it. Now we know that Solomon is pretty much the only king who had that much power. Because we know that his empire, Israel had its borders the biggest of any time in history. He had more possessions than any before or after him. And so we know that he is in the perfect position to be the author of this, because he said everything his eyes saw, he could get it. Nobody else has really had that kind of power. But he said there was vanity in that. It was meaningless for him to do that because it didn't involve God. That's what he gets around to, is that it didn't involve God, so it was meaningless. He talks about the meaningless of living wisely. Verse 16 of chapter 2 says, "For of the wise, as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten, how the wise dies just like the fool." So he's saying, no matter how wise you are, or no matter how foolish you are, you're all going to die. That just seems like dark and gloomy, but again, it's just a reality. And again, he gets to a point where he talks about the reality is that he didn't use it. He didn't use his wisdom like he should have. Now, chapter 3, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with chapter 3, maybe a little bit more than maybe what you were with some other parts of the book, simply because you've probably heard some of this before at funerals. Now, this chapter here is really, it talks about a time for everything. And so the first little bit here, basically the first 8 verses, we can kind of read over those and get an idea of what he's talking about. He says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck. A time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace." So, he goes through all these different life scenarios. There's a time and a season for everything. And now, as living, most of us have lived pretty experienced lives. I hope I still have a way to go. I just had a birthday, so I'm a little more experienced now. I'm not older. I'm still at 29, but now I have 14 years experience. So I hope that I'm a little wiser. But I hope I have many more years of experience to go while remaining 29. But it's life experience, right? We understand that, there is a time to be born. We know the process in which a birth happens. We know that there is a time to die. We know that, because of sin, the curse of sin, we know that there's a time where we will die. Our bodies are from the time that we're born, our bodies, even though we're growing, we're still breaking down. Our bodies are, every day that we live is a day that we're closer to death. And so it is a reality. There is a time for it. He said there's a time to laugh and a time to mourn. So we kind of know the difference. We know that when somebody's joyful, we know that when, maybe a joke is told that lightens the mood, and, we all, it's a good time to laugh. But we also know that there's a time to mourn. We know these things through life experience. And I think that's what he's talking about. There's a time for all these different things. Another thing that he talks about here is he talks about in verses 16 through 22. He talks about how we all go back to the dust of the ground. Again, it's just a reality. Now here he says some things that we can read and that we'll understand. He says in verse 16, "Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to the dust all return." Now here's where people try and say, well, this sounds contradictory. To me it just sounds like somebody talking. Now he's talking about man and beast. We all go to the same place when we die. Our bodies decay, they return back to the ground. Now, we can say, well, the Egyptians, they mummified people. And, they did a really good job of it because, there was a mummy found recently that was over 3,000 years old, or they dated so. I mean, it was pretty well preserved for being that old. We're talking, we're talking over, let's see. Yeah, it would have been well over 3,000 years old. And so, they kind of perfected it in their time. But traditionally, most people didn't have that. When somebody died, after a few hours, it started getting a little rank because immediately your body started breaking down. And so the reality is, no matter who you are, no matter what your status is, when you die, your body breaks down and you return to the dust of the ground from which God brought you. That's a reality. But then he goes on to say, verse 21, he said, "Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him?" So he's just having a thought. He asks a question. Haven't you ever asked a question of life? What will be after? I know that, a reality is knowing that we will all die at some point, but what will be after? That's a question that has been around forever, is wanting to know what will be after. And even today, with all the commentaries and all the scholars that have poured over God's Word and have looked at what it says about heaven, we still have no idea about what will be, because you have to go there to actually find out. We have people who said that they have been there, that they died and gone to heaven for like 23 minutes or 90 minutes or whatever. I don't know whether to believe them or not. But honestly, the only way that you'll know is when it happens and you go there. That's the only real way that we'll know what is after. So to me, this is just a question. To me, it's not saying that it's something contradictory. It's just asking the question. I don't think there's harm in asking questions. Because I think when you ask questions, it leads to you investigating. But he's speaking in relative terms. In chapter 4, he talks about something else. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, he talks about the oppressed. He said, "Again, I saw all the oppression that are done, all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun." So that's a very deep statement. It's a very philosophical statement. Think about that. Try and think about what's a better time to live, knowing what has happened, like, just say with like Nazi Germany, the atrocities that happened at Auschwitz, and the different things there, with so many Jews being rounded up and being sent to concentration camps and starved, and put in gas chambers and just being shot and put in a mass grave. I mean, think about the question that he asks here. And I'm sure he saw his fair share of atrocities. Because, they were just as brutal back then. If you remember, there were sometimes, that's why God sent them and had these fights with these people, was because they acted that way. They were brutal people. They killed brutally. Sometimes for no cause and no reason other than just to oppress. And so he's asking, he's asking these questions. In verse 3 he says, "But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are under the sun." So he's saying someone who's not born yet is a lot better off for having not even seen or experienced or having even felt any of these things. Imagine going through life and everything is sunshine and rainbows. And then all of a sudden your world is wrecked by realizing that there's this kind of evil in the world. It'll do something to you. Ronnie, I'm sure you're well aware of this. Phil, I'm not sure, I know your military service, but you talk about people who've been in the military, they've seen some things, and it changes a person. It's the same with, like with police officers, and firefighters. These people have seen some things that, we don't typically know about. It's horrible. We live in a somewhat civilized society, but think about other places who are not so civilized, where there's still tribal rule. He's just asking a relative question. He's asking these philosophical questions. It's deep thinking. I think that's why a lot of people don't like it, because it's deep thinking. It makes your brain hurt when you start thinking too much. In chapter 5, he talks about worship. He talks about fearing God, true worship. So in the first few verses there, he says, chapter 5 says, "Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know what they are doing evil." For they do not know they are doing evil. I think that's important. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools. And so again, I think this is just something that through experience he knows. Because think about it, if this was Solomon, think about offering, the sacrifices that were offered in the temple. Now, these offerings, he would not have done that. He may have been present at somewhere, but he would have not been doing it. The priests, they had a function. They would have been carrying out the sacrifices. Now remember, the sacrifices, they had meaning, because these were directives from God Himself on how to perform these things. God gave them strict instructions on how to carry out these things and what they meant. So whenever a priest would go and make sacrifices for the people's sins on the Day of Atonement, representing what Christ would do later on the cross. He would make atonement for people's sins once and for all. So, if this was Solomon, he would have understood what it represented for a meaningful sacrifice. To come in reverence and fear of God, to offer something in the right way, versus a fool's sacrifice. Now think about this. We know that Solomon became an idolater because of the wives and the concubines that he had, led him into this false worship. And so if you learn and understand what some of the worship was like and some of the sacrifices were like with these other pagan religions, you'd understand that these were fool sacrifices because what they were doing was evil. A lot of like the Baal sacrifice, a lot of it involved sexual immorality, and it involved child sacrifice. Obviously, those two things are evil in the sight of God. Those would have been foolish. Those would have been a fool sacrifice. So I think if you look at a God-sanctioned sacrifice versus a false religious sacrifice, I think maybe you could get if this was Solomon, you could get what they're trying to say, and it's understanding. I think we can relate that today in the same way when we come to church. Think about why you're coming to church. Are you coming and offering yourself as a sacrifice to God today? I'm dying to myself, and I'm going to carry my cross daily, but I've got to die to self. We come into the house of God and worship Him in that way, or are we coming as an obligation? Are we coming because that's what our parents did? Think about it. One way's right and one's not. Now I know those are two opposite ends of the spectrum, two different cultures, two different time frames. But I think you could cross a few of the same things there. But he talks about fearing God. And he talks about later on here in let's just finish reading this section here, verse 4. He said, "When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for He has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear." I think that's kind of the same, along the same lines as coming to church and saying, "You know what, God, I'm going to serve you with all my heart and not mean a lick of it." You just vowed something to God that you have no intention of paying. It's not me that you must fear. It's not your fellow man that you must fear. God is the one you must fear. I don't think most of us realize that. I don't think we think about that. And maybe that's part of our problem, is we don't think about it. You know, maybe that's why our churches aren't doing so well. Maybe that's why there's not as many people being saved today. Maybe that's the reason why there's not as many people coming to church today. There's definitely not a fear of God. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Now, if we look over into chapter 5, look over about verse 10. He starts talking about the vanity of wealth, the meaningless of wealth and honor. Verses 10 through 17 here, he kind of touches on that. Says, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity." I think that's exactly right. Because most wealthy people that you meet, they're not happy with what they have. They want more. You know, it was a Rockefeller in an interview. He was asked, you know, this is many years ago, said, you know, you're a wealthy man. How much money would it take for you to be happy? And he said, just $1 more. You think about that. That is such selfishness. A man who had that much wealth, but if I just have $1 more, I'll be happy. So you know that after he gets that $1 more, it'll be just $1 more. And then after that dollar, it'll be, well, just $1 more. And so that's what he's talking about here. Again, if this was from Solomon, Solomon was the richest king who ever lived. But yet Solomon, we really don't see where he was really that happy of an individual. We don't really have a record of him being this joyous, having a jovial heart like his father David. We have tons of record of David being jovial and dancing and you know, music playing and all this. We really don't have that of Solomon, except for right in the very beginning of his kingship, right when he builds the temple. That was the closest that we saw of where him and God were close. And he started drifting away after that. But I think if this was Solomon, then he absolutely understands that no amount of wealth is ever truly going to satisfy you. In verses 18 through 20, there's a little perspective that he adds on this. He says, "Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart." So what he's talking about there is perspective, basically, of those who have wealth and maybe those who do not. He's talking about sometimes that's your lot in life, but he's talking about what you do with it and what your perspective of is it. Now, we know that it's not a sin to have money and wealth. It's not. You know, even when Jesus confronted people, you know, he didn't say that it was a sin or an abomination for them to have that wealth and money that they did.
The love.
It's the love of money that's the problem. And so, but he says here, he says, you know, basically he's talking about if you have money or if you don't, he said you can find joy in your life with God in it, and knowing that your life is a gift from God. Him allowing you to do the things, you know, enjoying the fruits of your labor, no matter how little or how much they are, understanding that they are a gift from God. And now if you understand that, that they're a gift from God, you're going to use them in a better way, and you're going to be joyous over your life because of how you use them. And he talks about, he said, you're not going to much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. And I think about, just thinking about different things, there's a lot I don't remember about my life. There were some times where it was pretty, there were some times I had fun and did some different things, but, I don't remember a whole lot of my life. I don't remember every detail of it. But I know that as the longer I live and the more I enjoy a relationship with God, the more I look forward to the enjoyment that I have with Him. And I think that's what he's saying here, is that even within all that, looking to God, you're going to find your enjoyment there. Your enjoyment will be with God, no matter how long you live. I think that's something important and a good perspective to have. And so he goes on. In chapter 7, he talks about the wise rest in God's sovereignty. So verses 11 through 14. I guess just look at verse 14. We can just look at that one, verse 14 of chapter 7. He said, "In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider, God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him." So again, it's just a reality that things that happen in your life, if you have blessings, be grateful. If you have adversity, remember God's in control. You can go back and God can be sovereign in all of it. I don't think there's any greater time that we draw close to God than when we have some adversity. We should be drawing on Him in the times of the good as well as the bad, but it seems like, a lot of times we only go to Him in the bad. But we draw close, and I think, we do draw closer to God, but I think we grow when we trust God in our adversity, whether it be just a realistic situation, maybe something through no fault of our own, or maybe it is. I think we draw close to God. We get stronger in those situations when we trust Him. And I think that's what he's talking about here, is that God is sovereign over all of it. There's a lot that he talks about here. Chapter 8. Look at chapter 8, verses 16 through 17. Chapter 8, verse 16, he says, "When I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out, the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out." So there he's saying that there are certain things that are just beyond our understanding, no matter how much we seek it. Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, but yet he didn't know it all. Obviously, he was a deep thinker, because if you look at his writings, we know that, through his Proverbs and possibly this, we know that he was deep in thinking. And he sought after this wisdom, to understand and to know things. And, the philosophers, like during Jesus' time, we know that Paul, he often talked with the philosophers, which, all it is the search for wisdom. That's what philosophy means, is, the search for wisdom. But the thing is though we may ask these questions, but no matter how wise we are, we'll never know it all. And so in moments like that, we have to trust God that He knows what we don't. Because sometimes I think, we think that we know better than God. We know more than He does. But we have to understand that we don't. I think sometimes He lets us know that we don't. I think in those times we probably relate more to Job when God was talking to Job. He said, Job, were you there when I made the oceans and the earth and I separated them? It's kind of a big deal. Do you remember that? I don't remember you being there, Job. Do you remember when I did this? I seem to remember you not being there. I think that's what He does with us at times. It's like, Kevin, I just don't think I need your approval. I think I've got this. And he lets us know. But definitely the universe is beyond our grasp at times, but God knows. We're still asking, the smartest people on the planet right now are still asking, where did we come from and how did we get here? If you believe God, you know how we got here.
Amen.
And if you believe God, you know where we're going.
Amen.
But, for those, and even a child can understand that. But some of the smartest people on the planet still have trouble with that. In chapter 9, he talks about living in the face of death. And he's already covered this some. Talking about how we live in this life, and that we have to continue living on. Even though these things take place. Again, chapter 9, looking at the first part of that, is just facing realities. Facing that being able to face death, just knowing that is what we're going to face. Unless, of course, Christ comes back first, which that would be great. That would be awesome if He does. Any day, come on back, take us home. That would be wonderful and great. I'm not going to complain about that. But, just thinking about, if Christ does not come back by the end of our life, we know that, we are going to die. We know we must face that. And that, again, it's just a reality. Here's somebody who's facing a reality and talking about the meaningless of, worrying about all of these things when we know what our end will be. Because think about how many people that have already went on. Throughout our life, we have seen death. We have had to face death. And so we know. So, just living with that, living in the face of death, there's a way to do that. Now, as you read chapter 10 is written kind of like Proverbs is. It looks like a lot of different Proverbs, which if Solomon wrote this, then that would not be unusual, because it said that Solomon wrote a bunch of Proverbs. That he wrote many, many, many of them. just look at let's see.
I like verse 2 of 10.
Okay, now verse 2.
Yeah.
A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. I seem to remember seeing a meme on Facebook saying that maybe that is inclined to our political system.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
That was my point right there.
I knew where you were going with it. Yeah, you know what? That might be the only exposure that anybody has to the Book of Ecclesiastes. I think there's a lot of problem on both sides. But yeah, that's but traditionally, the right and the left, that's, it's talking about the right hand and the left hand, and we understand that in the greater context of things. But each of you can read these. Each of these are like little proverbs that come from life meaning and life experience. In chapter 11, it talks about kind of the mysteriousness of God in a way. Talking about how God has a hand in things and maybe we don't understand it. Look at verse 5. It says, "As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything." Now, think about that for a minute. Just think about how a child develops inside the womb. That's a pretty thing. That's a hard thing to comprehend. How that child develops. How the bones develop, how the organs develop. It's really and truly amazing. How do we really understand that? How do we understand how that happens?
All the intricacies involved.
Yeah. And see, that's the thing. That's the thing.
It just blows my mind.
That's the thing about, I don't think a lot of people really understand, but if you pay attention to a lot of the science that keeps digging, is able to keep digging deeper and deeper into the molecule itself, they are finding a lot more questions than answers. And they're starting to realize the intricacies of just a single cell is more than they can fathom. And there are more and more scientists starting to understand that this is designed. It's not by chance. There is an intelligent designer behind how just the cell works. Because a cell is so complex. Did any of y'all ever take biology or like an earth science or something like that in school?
Had to.
Yeah. So it was a requirement for me. It usually is for most people. But I'm sure the illustrations that they had of molecules, even when I went to school, were, elementary compared to everything that they know now. You know, even when I had to take biology when I was getting my undergraduate degree, you know, I mean, it was really complex. But as I've done my own study on these things, there is so much intricacy in a cell that it's mind-blowing. We just don't understand it.
Well, they didn't have the time in school to go through all of it. I think they knew more back then.
Yeah.
They just couldn't do it. They had to do the basics. That was all there was time for.
When we get into chapter 12, I remember reading there was a lot of people that said that there was a lot of issue with how the advice of chapter 12, and that this was troubling advice for youth. I'd say, you know, seems dark and gloomy. You know, typically that's not the kind of advice you want to, you know, give a youth, I guess, is, you know, telling them the life is like that. But I think there is one thing here, if we understand and we look at the context of how he's writing. He's talking about life experience, the meaningless of how some things in life are. But look at the very end of this and where he's talking about verse 7. He says, "And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanities." So again, here he's talking about these different things. But in reality, he's talking about in the end of things, throughout life, whatever your life holds, whether you walk through dark or light, whatever happens, when you die, you return back to the dust. But he says, and I think this is a hopeful thing, he said, but your spirit returns back to God. Because he's recognizing what was the thing going back to creation. And I think if you look at this, he goes back to creation a lot. Where did things originate from? Where do we learn that there was a spirit put into a person? Or a soul, I guess you would say. That soul. Every person was given a soul. That's the thing that animates us. That's going to return back to God one day.
That's the only thing that will last.
That's going to return back to God. Your body may return to the dust of the earth, but your spirit is going back to God.
Yeah.
Your soul is going back to God. And here's the thing. What inhabits your soul? Is it the Spirit of God, or is it the spirit of the world? But either way, it's going back to God, and He will judge that soul.
That's right.
And if His Spirit is not found in that soul, then that life is meaningless. It is vanity of vanities. And so then we get to the very end of the book, the conclusion. And so again here, it looks like it's being written from a different perspective. See, again, I think, you know, if Solomon was having an amanuensis here writing this for him, he would have talked about, okay, I'm writing about this king, I'm writing about Solomon, And then in the middle of the book, he writes down the contents of what Solomon told him. And then at the end, at the conclusion, he says, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God, and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So again, I go back to this concept of a man who has lived his life with everything imaginable, and at the end of his life, realizing that his wisdom has brought him to the conclusion that he wasted his life away on meaningless things. And he's saying, remember this. Remember what I have said, talking about the meaningless things of life, but remember what is meaningful. Fear God and keep His commandments, for that is the whole duty of man. So, he ends here, I think, on a high and a hopeful note. He said, look, here's an example of how not to live. Here, in this short conclusion, here's the thing that you need to do in order to avoid all of the meaningless things in life. You can find meaning in life, but it has to go hand in hand with what your relationship is with God. Because your life, you walk in life without God, and that's walking without meaning. I remember there's a book called what is it? I want to say it's either God Hates Religion or Jesus Hates Religion. And basically it says, there was a summarized statement I remember, and it talks about if you take, basically, I'm trying to remember exactly how it says, but it was basically talking about take the word good. Basically, that's what religion is. Religion just teaches you to be good. But if you take the word God out of good, what are you left with? Nothing. So basically, religion is nothing. Religion is nothing without God. See, with God, it is a relationship. See, religion is what everybody else has. Relationship is what Christians have.
Personal relationship.
They have a personal relationship with their God. And so I think that is what this writer here, I think that's what he's trying to convey, is that the person, whoever reads this book, needs to understand that you should have a greater relationship with your God. You can find joy and fulfillment in your life no matter what your lot is in life, whether you're rich or poor or anywhere in between, no matter what your status is. What really matters and what is meaningful in life is what is your relationship with God like. If you are wealthy and have possessions, where is God in it? if you're on the other end of that spectrum, where is God in it? Because that's what matters in life. What is your relationship with God? I think that's what we find in the book of Ecclesiastes. I think that's the greatest question that it asks. So, that is the book of Ecclesiastes. So I hope that you'll go back and you'll read it a little bit more thoroughly, because like I said, we just go over the high points, we talk about a few things, but I hope you'll go back and read it. It's really insightful. There's a lot of really good information there. It's really relatable. And so go back and read that and think about the things we've talked about today, but also read ahead. For next week, we'll be in the Song of Solomon. And it's a doozy of a book to try and understand. So read ahead. Y'all have any questions or any comments? Anything you'd like to add?
Well, the more my relationship with Christ is, I don't ask him questions where I'm going or what's going to happen. And, you know, the Bible talks about don't worry about tomorrow, what you're going to wear, what you're going to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about trust in him.
Yep. Yep. Today's got enough trouble of its own. Don't worry about tomorrow, because there's enough going on today for you to worry about. But yeah, I agree with that. I think the more that I grow in my relationship with God, I'm not so much worried about where I'm going as to I can't wait to get there. You know, and it's I look forward to being in the presence of God.
Amen.
One day, being able to sit at His feet and in His presence for eternity, and you know, being able to see my son again, and you know, my grandmother, and you know, just you know, and I don't even know how much those things will matter once I see Jesus, because you know, that's you know, He's the reason why we're going there in the first place.
But when we see him, we'll you know, answer a lot of questions we ask ourselves when we got this flesh of a body.
Yeah.
The questions will even be important then. Are we even going to remember the questions we have now?
Yeah, that's kind of that's always.
I just can't comprehend that it's going to matter.
Yeah, that's the kind of view I take of it is, you know, will it really matter once we're there? I think a lot of things will be revealed once we're there. A lot of questions will be answered.
Whatever we really needed to know.
Yeah.
How it's going to affect us.
And if we're meant to know, you know, if any of those questions we had do matter, then we have eternity to work through them. Mm-hmm. So there's no rush. But, you know, we get to spend eternity.
I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, I mean, I've heard...
A lot of work.
I've heard preachers talk about, well, I just don't know if I want to go there because it sounds awful boring. And I'm like, what's wrong with
boring.
you?
How? No.
I'm
There's no time to get bored.
I'm like, what is wrong with you?
They
Have you
read
not-
this more thoroughly.
Have you not read any of the Bible?
No.
Apparently not.
Have you had the calling?
That's why when
Yeah,
I was facing elder or whatever on those Sundays, I always told everybody, you know, that you better do your work here because you're going to be busy there. You've got to practice.
It's like, you know, we're just practicing down here. I'm like, you know, you don't like doing this stuff now. What do you think you're going to do then?
That's what I always try to stress. We're going to be so busy, there's not going to be time for it. But it's going to be fun too. I just envision.
Have any of you had a chance to watch the Chosen?
No.
That show? Well, I mean, you can buy the first season on DVD. I think you can watch the first season on YouTube for free.
They've had it on, my computer doesn't work real good, so
I know that you can. There's an app that you can download and you can watch. You can like watch it on your phone. You can download the app and you can watch the episodes for free on the app. So I mean, there's different ways that you can watch it, but I would recommend it. It's so far what I've watched. It's been pretty good. It's been pretty touching. I think they've kind of took some liberties with a few things, but some of the things. I think the thing that strikes me is how they portray Jesus in this, because like in most of like the other depictions that we've had of Jesus, we all we saw was kind of like a serious side of Jesus. We didn't really see Jesus as a joyous person, things like that. And I think with this series, they've taken it in a way where, you see where Jesus is performing miracles and doing things like that. You see him having joy in those things. Where he's healing people, he's smiling, and there's the person being healed is crying, and that part of it, that part like really kind of hits you. It's like I believe that Jesus was a joyous person. I believe that he laughed. I believe that he enjoyed being around people. He loved loving people. And I think sometimes that's the thing that we've missed with other depictions of Jesus, is that they only focused on his seriousness. But in this, they focus on the other part, the seriousness, but also in his everyday life. He was a man. He ate. He slept. He was with his disciples. They had fun, and his first miracle was at Cana. A wedding was a joyous feast. And they would have, they would have been there. Imagine Jesus just being, bump on a log and, man, this is a drag. I really want to.
not the way I sell, so.
That's not the atmosphere. The atmosphere was a joyous, festive occasion, and with this series, that's how they portray it, as a joyous and festive occasion. And so far I've really enjoyed it. It's been really good. It's kind of hits you at a few moments where he does things, but
Who directed that? Gibson?
no. No, I'm not sure who. It's got a bunch of different directors, and but from what I understand, there is a sequel to The Passion of the Christ coming. It's supposed to be out next year.
Oh, that's probably
Yeah, that was what I was
Yeah, and it's supposed to come out next year. It was supposed to come out this year, in March, but it was put off, I guess, because of everything with COVID. They put it off, and it's supposed to come out March of next year. And from what I understand, the plot is supposed to be when Jesus died, what happened in the time that he died, or the time that he was crucified, from the time that he rose. So that's what the movie's supposed to be about, is that time in between.
Is that one also directed by Mel Gibson?
Yes. Yeah, and it's from what I looked at as far as the cast, everybody that was in the first one is also in this one.
That's good.
Yeah, and Jim Caviezel, he plays Jesus again. And,
He's good.
Yeah.
He was good.
yeah. Any other comments? All right, well, just read over Song of Solomon for next week. If you have any questions, bring those next week. If there's anything in Song of Solomon that you read that's you just want to bring to our attention, bring it up and let's talk about it. But otherwise, I appreciate y'all being here. And Barbara, would you close us out in prayer today?